Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I am Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we sit down with a remarkable guest to unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. This episode's guest is Abdallah Rothman. Dr. Rothman is a leader in the field of Islamic psychology and has authored numerous books and academic papers on the subject. He is co-founder, along with the late Professor Malik Badri, of the International Association of Islamic Psychology, head of Islamic Psychology at Cambridge Muslim College, and founder and clinical director of Dar al-Shifa. Dr. Rothman holds an MA and a PhD in psychology and is a licensed professional counselor and a board-certified registered art therapist. We talked to him about integrating spirituality with psychology, the nature of the soul, raising children with resilience, the value of discomfort and exploration, and how remembering is a key part of spiritual growth.
We met 2 years ago when you came to Spain for a program I was helping to lead to talk about Islam and mental health. And I had previously seen your videos, I'd listened to your lectures. I found it fascinating and intriguing. But I know that a lot of Muslims, and Joey, I'm assuming a lot of Christians, also think that these two fields are incompatible. I also know that a lot of folks in the secular study of the mind often think that religion is, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say incompatible, but maybe even irrelevant to mental health. So I'm wondering if you can share a story or an anecdote that led you to bring these two worlds together.
Yeah. At first I was thinking, oh God, the pressure of coming up with a intelligible story. But as soon as you said that, something came to me, and it's my grandfather was a pioneer in humanistic psychology. He was a student of Abraham Maslow, and he was a colleague of Fritz Perls, who developed Gestalt therapy. And he grew up in a Orthodox Jewish family, and he was very turned off by the orthodoxy and the religion and the sort of restriction of it. And he rejected it completely to the point where he abandoned his family, not only his religion, but kind of the whole thing. And he went into psychology, but his journey in psychology through humanistic psychology was looking at the human being and the sort of development through Abraham Maslow, the sort of hierarchy of needs, and this idea of what's the term that I'm trying to find?
Self-actualization.
Self-actualization. And in his work with that, he became really entrenched in it, and he was doing things that were pulling on different Eastern traditions like humanistic psychology does, but he still had this aversion to religion. And when I was just starting to get into psychology, I had a conversation with him, which happened to be my last conversation before he passed away. And I was telling him I was getting into psychology, and he said that he wished that he had spent more time bringing religion into psychology, because his own aversion to it also made him feel like this doesn't have a place in psychology, because his notion of religion was such about the human orientation to religion and how people use it, and the restriction and the sort of othering and the tribalism. And so he was at the end of his life realized this has not only a deep place in understanding the psyche of the human being, but as a humanity, as a human family, so much of our way of understanding ourselves in the world has been informed by these great religious traditions, that it's like the water that we swim in. And so he was saying to me, as a very secular, almost at least a-religious, if not anti-religion person, was saying, there's a blind spot here in throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so he was saying, I wished that I had looked more into religion and incorporated it. And so that for me was kind of like passing the torch of my family tradition in psychology. And so I was at the point in my own journey where I was kind of coming from at it from a different place. I had come to psychology understanding that psychology is the study of the soul. Like that's what the word means. And that I understood religions as trying to understand the soul. And so the connection point of psychology and religion is not necessarily the dogmatic doctrine orientation that we often have to religion, which can often be about people and in-group, out-groups and tribalism. But really underneath the hood of what all religions are trying to get at is understanding the essence of the human being and the human's journey in this life, and that definition of the human being this unseen, untangible aspect of it known as the soul. And so that's where, now to say, if you understand what psychology, where psychology started and what the word actually means, literally the psyche is the soul and the study of the soul, and then to understand that religion deals with the study of the soul, it's kind of an absurdity to say that they don't have a connection.
Okay, that's what an amazing first answer. I mean, you answered it. I'm like, I felt my heart pick up a little bit. I'm like, oh shoot, this is gonna be a cool conversation. Okay, so I have two big questions for you in response to that. The first one is, what did it look like for you to integrate Islam into your practice as a psychologist? Number one. And then number two, as you start to kind of unpack this idea of psychology, could you sort of give us your taxonomy of what soul, spirit, heart is from kind of from the Islamic tradition?
Yeah. So let me start with the first one. The interesting thing is that, so your question is, how do I basically integrate Islam into my practice of
I,
psychology?
I mean, for me, there's something incredibly compelling about receiving the torch from your grandfather who left Orthodox Judaism and said, no, actually, you need to integrate religion in some meaningful way. But the ways in which you have integrated religion is not to return back to Orthodox Judaism, but it's to
Right,
find your own kind of place
right.
within the universe of religion. So how did that happen?
Yeah. So the interesting thing here is that I was not looking to become religious. I was not looking to adopt a religion, nor was I um, coming at psychology from a place of let me bring Islam into it. And so what happened is they kind of converged at the same time, is that in my studying psychology, and all before I got into psychology, I was studying different religious traditions. I was traveling the world, living with Buddhist monks, I lived in the hills of Jamaica with Rastafarian elder. I lived with uh, a, a Hindu guru who taught me on a chalkboard because he was silent and took a vow of silence. I lived as a shepherd for a year in Palestine, and I studied the Torah, and I lived with the Black Hebrew Israelites, and I was like really getting into like what is the soul, and what is the commonality among all these traditions. And it was at the end of that I started saying, okay, well, I need to study psychology, because at the core of all this is the soul, and the soul is about, understanding who we are as human beings and how we develop in our humanity. And so my approach to psychology was always from this place of understanding it as the study of the soul and the development of the soul. And because I was already entrenched in spirituality and had this affinity for religions, even though my experience with the religions were similar to my grandfather's in that it felt like this in-group, out-group thing that kind of kept me moving away from the different traditions, because I was looking for the unification and I saw so much separation. But then in my desire to bring in a spiritual um, way of approaching psychology, I was looking for a science of the soul, right? Which is what psychology is in its essence, how it originated and what it means. And in my journey through all those different traditions, I found that the science of the soul was most articulated within the Islamic tradition. And I found it through studying with a teacher who was teaching this science of the soul. And I wasn't going to that to learn about Islam or to become Muslim. I was going to learn this science of the soul for that I could apply in my work as a psychologist. And then through discovering this like deeply transformative approach to healing the heart, not just the mind, I saw it and experienced it within this larger system of Islam that had all the pieces from all these different religions and traditions that I had studied. It was all kind of came together. And so I see Islam through the lens of psychology from the beginning. And I see psychology through the lens of Islam because that was the beginning of my career as a psychologist. And so even from the beginning of doing therapy with people, it was informed by this Islamic science of the soul. And so for me, it's a very different, I was never integrating Islam into psychology, nor was I integrating psychology into to Islam. To me, they are one and the same. And my path within them was the same.
So I'm gonna cut Joey off there because there's something that you said that I found really interesting, and I want to balance the specific with something a lot bigger. So you agreed to come on this podcast without really knowing what we were going to talk about, which I appreciate. But we often ourselves don't know what we're going to talk about. The angle we take is that we are two Midwestern men of faith. We're parents. We're raising kids, including boys, and we try to balance that commitment to faith and family and region with curiosity about the world. So we reach out to people we find fascinating who also help us think through questions that we think are really important. And one of the questions Joey and I often talk about is, what does it mean to raise a boy who becomes a man? And when you and I met, Dr. Rothman, and I just have to call you Dr. Rothman because you're like an ustad, so I can't, I'm sorry, I'm brown, I can't get out of it. It's like calling your parents' friends, you have to call them uncle for the rest of your life. Even if I'm 45 years old, they're always going to be uncle, right? So we met in the context of a retreat for young Muslim leaders in the south of Spain. These were remarkable folks in their 20s who had already accomplished a lot. But one thing that you mentioned really sticks out to me. You said you went out, you became a shepherd, you traveled to all these places, you met with these people, you separated, in effect, from your surroundings and went out to see the world and find yourself. And I think, and Joey and I both think that this is something that's kind of core to masculinity.
Yeah.
That you have to go away and you have to be apart and you have to be a little lost, actually. And you have to know how to find your way back. And sometimes it's literal in that your tribe will leave you in the woods and expect you to find your way back. But sometimes it's not quite as neat or clean. And the reason I'm saying that is because I do a lot of work with young Muslims. And young Muslim boys and men often live in communities now where everything is planned out for them. Their career choice, they're expected to stay close to home. They are expected to become doctors, with all due respect to doctors. They are expected to marry someone from their tribe. And I understand the impulse that drives parents in that direction. But I fear that in the process, they never get a chance to figure out anything about themselves. And I'm wondering, in your work, is that something you focus on or talk about or help people through?
Yeah. It's it's the classic hero's journey that you need to leave your home and then ultimately, even if it's to find that what you were looking for was right where you started, but the break away to go on this journey and whatever, the dark night of the soul, to go explore, to go into oneself and to really discover the reality of oneself, you kind of have to go out in the world to see how do you show up uh, in places where people don't have expectations of you, and you're not responding to the expectations that have been placed on you by your society, your culture, your family. And that's really the only time when we can experience who we are underneath the persona that we've kind of found ourselves in, to get at this deeper essence of the human soul. And and what I tell people, so kind of from a practical standpoint of what you're asking of, does that come into play in my work? So I've worked a lot in university setting. Even I've been a principal of a college of higher education. And usually in those academic settings, it's always like you're giving them academic guidance of like, stay in school and go on to continue your academic journey. And it's really important that you have this unbroken chain of study. And I always tell people, like, don't be so quick to have your life figured out. Like, take a gap year, Like that's something that we used to do back in my era. I took a gap year after graduating my undergrad, and I took a whole year, an entire year where I literally traveled around the world uh, on I think I only spent $2,500, including flights, for a whole year traveling around the world. That's a different story.
Can
But
can I
with
pause you there? I want to ask one quick question. When you made this decision, was that something your family was supportive of or invested in? Was that something that you just did on your own?
I'd say both. I would say my family certainly set the stage for me to feel like that was an option, and I recognized that that was an absolute privilege that I had growing up, and just the ability to even be able to leave my family and not need to support anybody. But also, like, we traveled a lot. They were adventurers. They were very open of exploration. Now, when I told them what I was doing, that I was like had a one-way ticket and I would be gone for 2 years, and I didn't know where I was going to go, that didn't sit with them. They weren't encouraging or of that per se, like my way of doing it, but certainly the openness and the like, you know, adventure. But I think I took it a little further, and I took it to the extreme. I even took it to a place that I often, even when I am, like you asked about, when I am guiding people or giving advice to young people in this way, I wouldn't probably tell them to do what I did, because it was quite extreme and risky. Like, so I would go to a place with a one-way ticket and not know where I was going to stay that night that I landed, in places that were like potentially dangerous. And I would go, and I had like a day pack with like maybe one change of clothes and like art supplies and almost no money. And when I would get there, uh, I was like in this stage of my life where I was just like really exploring the bounds of the human experience. And what I did is, when I got to a place, I made an intention to not have any boundaries up. And so I would approach people with total open heart and open eyes. And oftentimes when people travel as tourists, they take this stance of tourists. Like, I come from this other culture and I see this certain way, and I'm going to look at these other people out of interest, but almost like this anthropological distance of like, aren't the natives interesting type of thing. And people feel that, and they don't feel very good about it because you're othering them. And so what I did is I went and I would uh, just kind of show up as like, I'm a human being. I'm here to do what you do and believe what you believe and live like you believe, like you live. And so, for example, I showed up in Jamaica, of all places. There's some rough places in Jamaica. I didn't know where I was going to stay that night. I just opened my heart to people, and people would take care of me. And so I found myself in a village in the hills with this Rastafarian elder, and you know they invited me into their home, and I took off my backpack, opened it up, and gave everything to them that was in it when I first arrived. And so I think that gesture of like taking down those bounds and saying like I I'm honoring you and your way is really it got me to experience the raw level of like what do we actually have in common as human beings, even amidst the clear social cultural differences. But I was really on this quest to understand like what is the commonality and what are we as human beings that is underneath those differences. Not not saying that those differences aren't important, but actually honoring them, but then seeing what's underneath them. And it was through that experience that I was able to not only really see the reality of humanity and these different spiritual traditions and what we're all trying to do in them, but also it was how I developed in my own soul and my own getting to kind of come up against the things that I needed to work through. Because the more I took away the expectations and the notions of who I thought I was or who other people think I am, I have to like be who I actually am in the moment. And that scenario is how you kind of go on this soul, the journey of the soul. And it does require being uncomfortable and being in the unknown. And so I do think we need to encourage young people to a certain extent to take that journey, kind of like the Amish do, you know, in they have this very tight community, but at a certain age, they're like, look, you need to go out in the world and figure it out and come back and choose this. And that's something that a lot of people within religions aren't comfortable doing with their children.
Yeah, because it's risky, right? Because there is an
Yeah.
inherent risk involved. As you're talking about this experience in Jamaica, what comes to mind for me is this instruction from Jesus in Mark, where he says to his disciples, "When you go, don't take anything with you except for a staff. No money, no
Mm.
food." And the way I read that is that there is an instruction to be dependent upon the people that you're going to.
Yes.
Um, So I think that's incredibly interesting and profound that you kind of sort of innately you had this instinct to do that. The other thing that's coming up for me here is that you mentioned going to Palestine, kind of with these shepherds, and I just sort of made this connection in my head that in 6 months of my life when I was 19, I first got baptized, which is sort of like the initiatory moment for Christians and then ended up going and spending a summer in Palestine, where I had to, for the first time, sort of fly by myself internationally and find a bus to get to the checkpoint and then transition to the next bus, and how it was inherently risky, but there was a real moment there of finding myself, of figuring out what I cared about, of living out my values, on and on and on. So to circle back to the riskiness, the inherent riskiness of this invitation. Haroon and I are both parents. We have boys who are going to come to this initiatory moment for themselves. What would it look like for us specifically to encourage that in a healthy way of the kids, of the people that we are responsible for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is about in the ideal scenario. The ideal scenario is that you'd be putting the things in place as early on as possible, like from the beginning of their life. You know, sometimes it's tough when I talk about the developmental stages of reality, and people are like, oh, I missed out on this initial stage. Now what do I do? But like if we were to look at ideal, in Islam, there's a principle of pedagogy that says 777. So you play with them for 7 years, you teach them for 7 years, and you befriend them for 7 years. And it aligns up with like Erickson's stages of development. But essentially, if you were doing that and following that with your boy, and you, in the first initial 7 years of his life, your main way of interacting was playing and literally getting down to his level and making him feel safe, but also connecting with like the realm of play because that's how his being is engaging with the world. And so what it does is it establishes trust and safety. And so you have this 7 years built of trust and safety, and then they get into 7 to 14, which is the when the window is open for the ego to receive instruction without as much of a need to push back. And then in that window, you're teaching them values, how to be careful, how to trust, who to trust, who not to trust, how to manage their own, all these different parameters of how to engage in the world so that they can use their intelligence to be as safe as they can, right? And smart. So it's like street smarts as well as information and intelligence, but also like humility and honoring other people. And this in Islam, this would be akhlaq, like manners and ways of engaging. And so then by the time they're 14, so that was the age that I went and started traveling the world and really going out and seeking when I was 14. I didn't leave the country, but I was traveling within the US at age 14, and then it kind of carried on from there. And so if you think of it of like if you've done all that, then at the age that they're 14, you kind of have to, if you're aligned with like how the human trajectory works, they're no longer your responsibility in the same way that they were before. I mean, you still have the responsibility to them, but it's kind of like they're a child of God and you have to kind of let them into the world. And if you've done all that work beforehand, then you can know that at least you've done your best. Like as we would say, you've tethered your camel, and then the rest is leaving the outcome to God and recognizing that they need to go on that journey, and you've equipped them for the journey with the tools and the protections and the knowledge that they need to now traverse that on their own.
So I just want to jump in. I actually had another question, but I want to go back to this, is that, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, I promise, but this is really at odds with how a lot of Muslim communities raise their kids these days.
Yeah.
And we live in communities where your profession is decided for you, your spouse is outlined for you. We don't live maybe in the circumstances my parents or their parents did, where your spouse was often just chosen for you and would be someone from within your immediate community and your family circles and networks. And it was always someone known. It was almost unheard of to marry outside of your clan, your tribe, what have you. And obviously there are certain reasons for that. They're not necessarily bad reasons, but as you say these things, one, they resonate with me. I see that with our youngest, for example, who is 13, but I notice that if I do a kind of head-on approach and try to bang my head against his wall, that doesn't work. But if I come around, if I do it circuitously, and I don't mean that in a dishonest way, but in the sense of just kind of laying it out for him, that, hey, maybe you don't want to do this right now, but here are a few reasons why this class might be a good idea, or this program might be a good idea, or you should stick it through even if you don't like it. Many times he comes around and we have a thoughtful conversation. So I get that. What I'm trying to balance in my head is how different the approach a lot of Muslim parents take from what you're saying. And how do we, is that a tension we should live with? Is that something we should call out? And maybe building on what Joey's saying, what are some practical ways that you would encourage parents who live in the milieu that, for example, I do, where a lot of these ideas would be received with surprise at best? What are some practical ways in which we could maybe mitigate some of the worst effects of that, or maybe present the better side of some of these approaches?
Yeah. I mean, the reality is we have to live with it because it's how it is. We either resist it and sort of put our head in the sand, or we acknowledge that we've got to work within where we are. And so living with it is the only choice. But I don't think that means being complicit and going with the way that everybody else is doing it. It means recognizing that things are different. The things that were in place that allowed for even primarily, Muslim communities to do what I was suggesting is because there was a larger paradigm and communal system that supported it. So, for instance, there was like what was known as Fatua guilds, which are guilds of young men where they would be, as a community, have a place to come and learn, be mentored and learn self-mastery through the mastery of like a craft or a skill or a discipline, like archery, horse riding, wrestling, and then like the craft of like preparing, making a bow or doing blacksmithing, and that these things are things that the community needed anyway. And so you can see it as like a vocational training. But what they did at the same time was they were a vehicle to learn manners and behavior and self-mastery through the mastery of these crafts. And what that does is it's a perfect stage of development to sort of usher these youth into adulthood. And they can't do it on their own. They need guidance. That's the whole idea of rites of passage, is that you're passing on the rights of manhood from people who have gone through that, and that not just sending the kids out on their own into the woods and saying, you know, good luck. And that's kind of what we do, even though we think we're holding them in within this tight world to keep them away from the world. But now, like, that outer world is in your home through the internet and through all the information highway. And yet, what the only thing people focus on is, well, we're going to tell them that they're Muslim or Christian. We're going to send them to the mosque or the church, and we're going to kind of limit their, like, on a surface level, tell them what their identity is. And a lot of times, especially what I know with the Muslim community, there's this belief that that's going to somehow get passed to them in the bloodline. They're like, oh, we're Muslim, so therefore they'll be Muslim. But what those first, second generation families don't realize is that the reason that they had that is because their parents lived in a place where that paradigm was in place, that social structure was there. And so now we're sort of taking the same way of being in a completely new environment and expecting the same parameters to be in effect when they're not. And so the only way that we can mitigate that is by adapting to the current situation and putting the principles don't change because they're based on the reality of human development. Like the whole idea of 777 doesn't change because we live in an era where there's information is faster. Like there's still a humans are humans because of first principles of the reality of the nature of the human being. We have to adapt that and how we deal with that to the now new modern context. But the first principles are still the same. And what I mean by that is like the nature of human being and how the human being works and that psychological reality of how we respond to things. But now we need to meet those same developmental needs in creative ways. So because there isn't this like localized communal structure, then we have to do it in other ways. But like, maybe you don't have the uncle in your home or down the street or next door, but they need then a surrogate uncle or mentor, even if it's like at a community center or if it's in some other way that is accessible. These systems, without them, not only the individual, but the community suffers.
Yeah, as you were talking about the 777 thing, where I went in my head was, but wasn't that for a specific cultural and historical context? And how does that exactly work in this moment when we have things like, delayed adolescence and all this kind of stuff that's happening? And you started to get at kind of that tension there and the need for creativity. The thing that I'm really drawn to though here is your mention is how you mentioned first principles, and I'm sure you've done a lot of work around this to think about what those first principles are for the human person. Could you just lay some of those out for us? Like what's the foundation that you're building off of in terms of your anthropological view of the human person?
It's a complex answer because there's different levels. So like for instance, if I were to answer that from like you said, an anthropological perspective, that would still run parallel with like all other par theological faiths. This is where we get that the first question you asked me of like where does religion and psychology meet is that if religion represents like a worldview that is informed by a certain theological framework, right? And that's kind of the paradigm of reality and existence, epistemology and ontology. But psychology is claiming to represent the sort of science of the human being, right? So we often think we study psychology as a science because we think, and this is why it's gone in the direction of cognitive neuroscience, because there's something to study that's material. But if we're looking at the whole human being, which psychology originally looked at, it involves inherently philosophy because there's an element of understanding the the transcendent reality of the human being, or if you don't believe in the transcendent, at least the unseen aspects of the human being that neuropsychology or cognitive neuroscience can't necessarily answer. And so and so the
I think
yeah.
I think that's amazing. I think for me, the thing that I'm wondering about here is you have these kind of situated instruction that in your mind is integrated with the basic composition of the human person, right? So in Islam, there's this idea of 777. Um, I also hear you talking about creativity, about the need to understand the ways in which those instruction meets this present moment. Um, but the tension point with adaptation and creativity is that you always risk kind of losing the heart of the matter when you start to innovate and adapt,
Hmm.
right? And so what I'm thinking about here is when we look at principles that are founded within our religious traditions and we say, yeah, but it needs to be adapted for this present moment. What are the essentials, the first
Hmm.
principles that we need to maintain so that we don't lose the heart of what those instructions are
Yeah.
giving us?
I mean, essentially, those are definitions of human nature. So, how we understand and define consciousness and the the root of drives and motivation, and also how we understand like what is human purpose? Like what is the purpose of the human being and life? And where does that trajectory lead us to? Like so if your belief system believes that the human existence is random and that when we die and it's all a physical biological definition, then that's going to fundamentally change what your orientation to like not only the study of the human being from an anthropological standpoint, but also what why what are we concerned of and what are we doing? What's the end point? And so, but if we get down to like brass tacks of like what are the things that are common throughout all these things that, regardless of theological standpoint, you're gonna come down to like people always have this question of like uh like happiness and human flourishing. And human flourishing is often talked about in the sense of, what is needed for the human being to be at a state of equilibrium and sort of contentment. And so that's where a lot of psychology is looking at the relative orientation to somebody's um, being okay in the world. And so
Can I jump in on that? Because
yeah, yeah.
I have a clarifying question if you don't mind. Because it's really interesting when you said equilibrium and that balance thing. Because it's sitting with me that something you mentioned to me. I don't know if it was when we were together a couple years back or subsequently. Was this idea of sacred? Was it called sacred bypassing?
Oh, spiritual
Spiritual
bypass.
bypassing. That's correct. My apologies. So, in effect, if I understand correctly, it's sort of like rather than deal with a problem that has a discrete or concrete approach, you try to basically pray it away. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
being a little bit crude about it, but I have a lot of, I have tension in my family. I need to have a conversation with my wife or with my uncle or what have you. But instead, I'm just going to do an extra like 200 sunnah at night rather than deal with the problem. And that's not to say that prayer isn't important, but that I'm praying instead of acknowledging the problem. So I'm wondering if there's also on equilibrium, if you think there's a kind of, for lack of a better term, almost secular bypassing, where I think that in American culture right now, we have these obsessive fads and trends. And again, I don't mean this in a negative or disparaging way. We kind of turn everything into a mental health issue and sort of we turn to meditation, wellness, when I wonder if, and actually Joey and I have talked about this, if we're missing God, right? That we're missing some deep existential need in our culture that we turn to consumerism or perhaps politics and polarization, physical fitness, whatever it might be, consumption, instead of addressing that role of faith. So, and I know that's tough territory to cover in a lot of Western contexts, but I wonder if, because now you live, if I'm right, you live in Abu Dhabi now.
Yeah.
So you live in a culture where, I mean, religion has a more pronounced role than certainly does, I would assume, in many ways than in the United States. Like when you go back to the US, for example, or you go back to the UK, do you feel that? Do you see that? Is it something?
Yeah, I think the thing that human beings get stuck in is regardless of where they are and what their religion is, or is that we bypass our own truth. And like the human being gets stuck in like not necessarily owning up to and looking at themselves honestly, like psychological honesty, and we go through this process of trying to get rid of problems. We sort of problematize problems as like, well, this is uncomfortable. I don't want to be uncomfortable, so I'm going to do whatever I can to get rid of the uncomfortable. And so it can either be physical pain, right? Physical pain, uh, we have this allopathic approach to medicine where we try to get rid of the symptom without necessarily looking at what is the symptom bringing and showing us. And this is all has to do less so with like what religion and theology you choose, and more about reductionism versus holism. And we live in a time in the contemporary person, regardless of what religion they're a part of, is very influenced by reductionist thought and materialist thought and dualism. And it's all material, and let's figure out what we need to do to remove a certain thing to get to we perceive equilibrium as contentment and happiness, which is like the removal of problems, right? But what the human, if you look at the human uh, existence throughout time, there's always been trial and tribulation. There's always been traumatic things that happen, and that growth and development and sort of realization and integration come from moving through those difficulties and facing ourselves. Coming to terms with ourselves is not necessarily we going towards like let me comfort and the lack of difficulty and pain being the ultimate goal, but actually integration and acceptance of what is as being the goal. Like coming to real contentment, which is really like the place where the human being can come into equilibrium, is coming into acceptance with what is. And we find all kinds of ways to avoid facing ourselves. And this is what the COVID experience did for a lot of people, is that we were so busy in our lives and all of our distractions and being out in the world that allowed for us to be comfortable. And then when you took all that away and people had to sit with themselves, it was really for people that didn't have a system to work on like facing with what comes up. there was a lot of difficulty that came up because people were a lot of the things that they distracted themselves were removed, and they had to take account for what is. And I think that's, if we were to boil it down to like the common denominator of humanity, human existence, and this idea of mental health or well-being, it's bringing into balance the holism experience of the human being, which very much entails coming to terms with who we are and facing up to um, what we're not looking at. Like we have masks that we wear in the world. We sometimes kind of lie to ourselves. We hide things in our life. We're not fulfilling our whole potential because of all these limitations or perceived limitations. And so I think it's about like breaking through those things and facing reality.
This episode is brought to you by Queen City Diwan. We build experiences, adventures, and retreats for travelers of all ages and backgrounds. We design journeys so you can take friends and family and make friends and family, because we believe who you travel with and who you become along the way matters just as much as where you go. This September, we'll be in Uzbekistan. In October, we're leading a remarkable pilgrimage across Saudi Arabia. And in January, we're offering a leadership retreat exclusively for college students, a journey across Andalusia, helping students connect with their heritage, discover their purpose, and realize their incredible potential. Visit queencitydiwan.com to find out how you can join an unforgettable adventure with me, your co-host, Haroon.
I love the idea that human flourishing is not independent of suffering. I think that yeah, that resonates with me really deeply. Um, I also want to ask you a question here, and Haroon, I'm going to need your help a little bit to frame this. But one of the ways in which traditional Christian theology sort of frames human nature is through the creation story. And it talks about something like, we would say, original sin. There's been a lot of backlash against that, and I actually have some I have some discomfort with that framing. But that's one way that that story is read, right? And the way I understand the Islamic tradition is that the idea of original sin doesn't quite fit, but there is this sort of orientation towards forgetfulness within that story. Um, and I and I and I know that those different orientations have dramatic implications with how you view human nature
Yeah.
and what the invitation is for the human person. Um, so I wonder, like, how do you make sense of that tension between
Mm.
these two traditions? What would you point to as kind of like the core essence of human nature? Big philosophical question. And how does that play out in your perception of human flourishing?
Yeah, so my view on this, which is certainly influenced by Islam and like I would say aligned with Islam, but to be very honest, was something I was searching for that I already had that I found in Islam. Like I was oriented in this way to begin with. And it is that all human beings are essentially we all have the same nature. We all have the same soul. There is no difference between us. The differences between us are uh, only in this corporeal world, how we show up. And so that common humanity is based in the soul, and that the soul has this pure nature, and that when we come into the world, that pure nature is simply uh, covered over, like veiled, and that our work in this world is to do the work that we have to do within our own agency using our own will to uncover that truth. And that process of uncovering, which is really a back and forth and a constant sort of like forgetting and remembering, is really just about turning away from the truth that we already saw before we came into this world. Like we all, I believe that we all had, every human being, not like regardless of whether you're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, we all have the same essential soul, and that soul is pure, and that it knew the reality of uh, existence and God, and that it was only at the point that we came into this world that that became covered over and we forgot. And then we're now on a journey to really, in some sense, you could say come back into remembering, but I don't believe it's going backwards because I believe we have this opportunity to actually get further than that there's levels of realization and actualization, you can say. And that the dynamic fluctuation in this human journey of like forgetting and remembering is that we're made as human beings to forget, because the whole setup it's a test, and we're gonna be veiled. That's like part of the veil. And so this idea of making a mistake and sinning, and this idea that the sin somehow gets deep into the soul to a point where it's like blackened on an essence level, is not something I believe, nor is that really aligned with an Islamic view. And I agree. I think there's a lot of Christian thought that wouldn't agree with that either. But the idea is that it's really just that the soul remains pure. There's an aspect of our being that is always pure. And in Islam, this would be understood as the natural disposition of the human being, based on the ruh, which is the spirit. In Hebrew, it's ruach. Same thing in Arabic, it's ruh. That essential nature is pure, and it's connected to existence and oneness and being able to see that. And the only thing is that our relative orientation to what we're doing with ourselves in the world, and our identification with ourselves as separate beings, and our persona, and which is wrapped up in our desire and our thoughts and all this, is relative to how we cover over that truth or not. And the irony here is like, and so as religious people who don't have this sort of deeper spiritual understanding of human existence, and they're seeing religion just as this like tribal, dogmatic, I'm a part of this theology, there's this thing where, you've maybe heard the word kafir. It's like people, they'll say the infidel, right? But really the word in Arabic comes from kafara, which just means to cover over. And it's covering over the truth. And so to a certain degree, everybody is in a relative process of covering over and uncovering, even just throughout the day. So like you can be in a state of Islam when you're uncovering, and then the next moment something happens and you forget and you're covering over the truth, right? It's not, and so that rather than sin, it's really just like turning away and then turning back. So the word for repentance in Islam is tawbah, which means to turn. And the word for heart in Arabic is qalb, and it comes from the word taqallab, which means to turn. The heart is a turner. And so when we turn our heart to God or truth, then we're in line with that essence that already is inside of us. And when we turn away, we're covering over and we're forgetting. And so even like the Arabic word for human, insan, is the same root as forgetfulness. And so it's just this like, I forget and then I remember. And so here's the beautiful thing is that we often see like sin or mistakes as this bad thing, and we should never do it again. And it's like the worst thing that the person can do is sort of do what God doesn't want you to do. But every time that you turn away, it sets you up to be in a position to choose to turn back. And it's in this choosing to turn towards your truth and the truth of your soul and the truth of humanity in general, that is like the sweetest, highest position of the human being, because we have the ability or the tendency to stay in forgetfulness, and we have the ability and the possibility to choose with our will, to align our will, and it's that turning that is like where the human being is at its highest state. So that kind of goes in line with Christian thought of like, God is with the sinners, like when you're recognizing your neediness and making the effort to remember is when you're kind of fulfilling your purpose as a human being.
When you mentioned actually that was really beautiful that we're all in a relative state of moving away or moving closer. And something I noticed a few years back is I moved to Ohio about 5 years ago and started attending a big suburban masjid where there's just a huge number of people. The Friday prayers is about 2,000 people, and you realize that it's a community so large that most people don't know each other. And so a certain level of intimacy is lost. And one thing I noticed very early on is that during the Jummah khutbah, the Friday sermon, half the congregation was on their phones. Now, I know from a Sharia, maybe from a fiqh point of view, that prayer, the sermon is your attendance is invalid if you're distracted, if you're deliberately doing something. It's no different really than pulling your phone out in the middle of a prayer and just start texting someone before you go into ruku, right?
Right.
So it's a big deal. And my initial thought was, well, perhaps a lot of people don't know that. And when you have a very big community and you have all kinds of people, all different walks of life, you have different levels of awareness. And then something occurred to me was that perhaps people can't actually get off their phones. That whether or not they know it is almost irrelevant. And actually something my brother once said to me about, well, he said in passing that stuck with me is we're all addicted to our phones. It's whether or not we admit it.
Mm.
And then we do something about it. And the reason I thought that was interesting is because there's been a conversation in the United States and around the world, Jonathan Haidt, for example, anxiety, smartphones, children, and all of that's important, brain rot and what it does to your cognitive capacities, your ability to focus. But we don't really have a conversation about how it's affecting adults from a religious and spiritual point of view. And you mentioned that religion is hard work, right? To pay attention every day, as you said, that am I in a state of obfuscation or of opening and turning back? And that requires a constant kind of mindfulness. And obviously, as we get older, hopefully we become a little bit more aware of ourselves or at least aware of our shortcomings and where we need to do work. But it occurs to me that our devices make that really hard.
Yeah.
And what I personally find alarming is that in Muslim spaces, I feel like there's almost no conversation in a lot of institutions on a granular level about what this is doing, not just from the academic point of view, which is important, but from a faith-based point of view. I see so many people in the masjid, they bring their kids and they just stick their kids on a phone. And what they're teaching the kids is deleterious to their faith, to their
Mm.
psychosocial development, all of that. But it's also in us. Like I find myself doing that. That when I'll
Yeah.
be praying, I'll silence my phone, and I hear the buzz, and my mind is gone.
Yeah.
Right? That I don't know what that was. Was that a WhatsApp notification? Was it some stupid Substack announcement? Joe Walsh is going live, right? And I don't know why Substack does that, but it does. But my point is, how do we? What is that doing to us? And what should we be doing to push back?
I think it's feeding into a tendency that we have to be distracted, right? It's already innate in the human being. It's like based on what I just kind of laid out is like the world that we live in is essentially a field for distraction from our core job, which is to be present with what is real in ourselves and doing this process of turning. And so now we live in a time where people have designed this devices to use as a device to kind of to prey on that tendency of human beings. And so it's not the internet and the devices that are the problem. It's the tendency that we have towards distraction that is the problem. And so it's more intensified now because we carry them in our pockets. But it still comes down to like we have it makes it even more uh, prominent and present in our need to focus on our will. So it's like, whereas if you set yourself up to live in a community that's holding these things in place and constantly providing reminders, then you could actually get by through the day and not assert your will so much in this process of turning and remembering. and using the discipline of your will and alignment. But now, because of this situation, and if we agree to this social contract of carrying this thing in our pocket that's a constant ding, ding, ding of distraction of the veil of the corporeal world, then we have to kind of recognize what we're agreeing to, what we're signing up for, and that means that we then have to amp up our self-control and amp up our discipline. And so as adults, we can consciously make that choice and say, okay, well, I'm going to rise to the challenge and I'm going to be more disciplined. But if we're thinking of it as like, how do we protect our kids when we look at like that, what we were talking about before, if they're still in a phase where we're trying to teach them and we're trying to set them up for tools to be successful in the world, then we have to regulate that for them. I don't believe in like completely keeping them away from it, because then they'll be lost in trying to fend for themselves in the world, because those are the tools of the world. But if we come back to this idea of first principles, the thing that doesn't change is that human beings find equilibrium and find their nature when they are in nature. Like there is a reality to the fact that we have to be connected to the natural world and spend time breathing fresh air, looking at green, being around trees, walking on the earth. Like it's fundamental to the human being. It's why we're tied to agriculture and all these things, and the rhythms of the sun and the moon, and so digital platforms take us away from that. And so one of the things that I always tell people is that we've got to you've got to have this like balancing effect. So I tell my kids and I tell parents of kids that they should, for any amount of time that you're going to be on a device or engaged with some sort of technological, you have to spend that same amount of time in your day being outside, playing outside, being in nature, experiencing the natural world. And that may, sometimes that's being outdoors. I think that's the most direct, but it can also be like emergent interaction with human beings, like old analog type of games, like board games where it requires human engagement. Uh, there's something about those ways of engaging, not just for kids, but for adults as well, that brings forth aspects of our self and our remembering and engages utilizing our will.
I love that. Emergent human interaction.
Yeah.
That's great. Um, I have a huge theological question for you. Okay, so
Okay.
here we go. Um, so you talk about how humans, all of us, have this core of purity, the soul that I would call, I don't know, inherent goodness or blessing or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Um, if that's the case, why do you think that God has created us with the inclination to forget? Like, if that's our core kind of reality, if that's our truest self,
Yeah.
what is the design intent behind making us inclined to forget?
So in the Islamic tradition, there's this notion that why did God create the universe is because he was a hidden treasure that wished to be known. And so the idea behind that is that the knowing, the coming into knowledge of something is like illuminating on it and recognizing its glory and greatness. Whereas if something is what it is and it's hidden, it's like, wow, this is amazing, but there's nobody to witness its amazingness, its glory. And so the whole setup of forgetting or the possibility of doing even evil or forgetting is that there within that inherently sets up the possibility of remembering, or this whole idea of turning. You can't remember if you don't forget, right? So the remembering, the remembering, like as an active state of turning, is that highest level of glorifying God. And so that, without that, there would be no need for the existence of the world or human beings, right? Because what this does is it creates levels of possibility of unveiling. And when you unveil, you reveal the essence and the glory and the, and in God, in both the Christian tradition, I would say all traditions, there's this notion that the ultimate reality of God or divinity is beyond human conception and is beyond the different levels of what we perceive from our linear kind of occluded situation where we see things in like, oh, that's great. Oh, that's even greater. Oh, he's amazing. Oh, he's incredibly amazing. And so that sets up the continual possibility of revealing that glory.
Haroon, back to you. I just think that's the implications of that for me is that something like forgetfulness or sin becomes much less shame oriented, right?
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
You
So
know, the in the Quran, there's what's called in the Islamic tradition what's called the Asma al-Husna, which means the beautiful names. It's 99 names of God, and that we see these as qualities of God's manifestation in the world. And out of those 99 names, I think it's six of them have to do with forgiveness. And so there's this like, it's like the one who forgives, the one who actually implements that forgiveness, the one who removes everything that was completely removes the thing that was forgiven. Like, so there's this element of the act of forgiving that is such a fundamental and beautiful aspect that is inherent in this idea that yeah, there isn't a finality in sin or mistakes. Um, there isn't a shame in it. It's actually like, hey, this is what we're set up to forget. We're set up to make mistakes. And in your meagerness, in your meekness, it says the meek will inherit the earth. In that recognition of your neediness is your highest state. Because when you're recognizing you're needy, you're recognizing God is greater, that you're reliant on him. Whereas if you're always buttoned up and you do everything right, it's very easy to not give glory to God. It's like, oh, I did this because I have it all together. But if you're making mistakes and you're in need of guidance and in need of sustenance and in need of all this, it positions you to be a servant of the master.
Oh, it's beautiful. We had a guest on our second episode, actually, Shadi Hamid, where he mentioned that one of the common criticisms of religion is that it's a crutch. And he said that, well, sometimes I need a crutch. And what I love about what you just said is it's not just that we sometimes or actually all the time need a crutch. It's that in recognizing the need of the crutch, we become better people. And when we deny that neediness, we we become arrogant, we become dangerous to ourselves, to others, to the world. And I think there's a lot there. And so for
But I
what
don't even think it's
next,
religion. It's not even necessarily religion. Because religion, so much of how we understand religion is like the list of do's and don'ts and or the
sure.
the thing that you're supposed to do or supposed to believe. But if we remove that orientation to like organized religion, which is what humans do with these systems, and we look just at truth, then it's less about using religion as a crutch and more about just seeking truth and revealing truth, which then comes down to just that common denominator of what all human beings are faced with. And then the crutch is less about the religion and more about, or I wouldn't even use the word crutch, but the crux of the matter is the person's will, the person's alignment of their choice. And this is that whole age-old discussion of like, is it predestination or is it free will? And that's where it all comes to recognizing that our experience here as human beings, it's a paradox. It's not either or, it's both and.
So I'm going to do something terrible now because you just said something really profound. And my unfortunate rejoinder is I have lots of questions, but I have a hard stop in 13 minutes for a reason that is actually related to my next question. So I'm going to ask if it's okay with you. I'm going to ask a few questions, and I'm not going to have you pretend that your answers are going to be exhaustive or should be seen as definitive and comprehensive. So if there's something you want to say to that, go ahead. If you want to pass, just say pass. If you
Okay.
if there's
Like
not
the
enough,
light, this is the
it's
lightning
a
round?
lightning round. Yeah,
Okay.
sure, exactly. It's a lightning round. And the
Okay.
reason I say this, so actually, I have a physical therapy appointment in whatever it is, 43 minutes. And this is actually related to my first question. So I had an old back injury back when I was 20. When I was a lot younger, I used to weightlift, and I was really good at it. And now I go to the gym, and I think it occurred to me after several successive aggravations of that same injury that probably what I need to do in the gym now is not what I needed to do when I was 20. Back then, it was vanity with clear and tangible results. More, it's like now sustainability at best, or perhaps delaying my inevitable mortality, right? So it's not working out to feel good, it's working out to stay alive and be able to pick up a box. So the reason I'm saying that is that as we get older, as men, as people, how we exercise changes. And I'm wondering if there's something you can say to us, to Joey and I, to our audience, to those of us in our audience who are older, what should we be doing mentally and spiritually to prepare for getting older?
Well,
That's a great lightning round question, you got to admit.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I would actually start with your metaphorical example and take it out of the metaphor. And part of that is like staying physically active is not necessarily just for longevity. It's about um, occupying your being. So like I lift weights. I don't lift weights to get big. I do it to remind myself of my existence and to ground myself in my ground of being. So like when you isolate your muscles, you're literally putting, I exist here. I'm here. This is who I am. This is where I am. And it grounds you in this, what I would say, like between the vertical and the horizontal. And when I go to the gym and I'm doing these physical things, I don't go in there thinking I want to prolong my life because I believe that I don't have that power. But I'm doing it to actually integrate my my transcendent connection and with my physical connection because I'm kind of preparing for that next journey. And so I'm turning 50 this year, and I feel like it's a huge shift in my way of doing things and what I'm doing. It's like in some senses I care less about things, but what it's doing is making me focus on what is more important. And so I think my advice would be to like let go of what your original trajectory was of what you think success would be in your life and actually be willing to be in the here and now and like recalibrate to this new phase of life, which is totally different. You can't use the same parameters of when you were young. It's a new phase. And it's meant to be about like legacy and like who am I in this world and what am I doing here and what am I going to leave behind because it's going to end eventually.
I'm gonna play that clip when I next dip out on the family to go to the gym. I'm because that was beautiful. I love that. But now I can use that, right? It's no longer vanity. It's
Yeah.
anchoring myself and my being in the world. Also, you've done a good job of that yourself, I see. So alhamdulillah. The second lightning round question, marriage, discuss.
Oh, that's not a question. Oh, just marriage.
I get to
Uh,
do that though. Yeah, just it's not even a
yeah.
lightning round, it's just a lightning round.
Uh, well, I think people should understand that marriage is an opportunity to know yourself better, not necessarily an opportunity to avoid yourself more. And oftentimes we think we go to marriage and we try to find a female or male version of ourselves where we're gonna be comfortable, we're gonna come home and it's all gonna be easy and comfortable and have the white picket fence and then we just set ourselves up for disappointment, but we also miss out on the whole opportunity of marriage, which is to have this person that's very different from you, that reflects to you what you need to work on for yourself. And if people were to embrace marriage as the way that they're gonna see what they can't see on their own, and embrace the difficulty, embrace the things that your spouse is annoyed with you about, it highlights what you might need to own up to and work on, so if we approach it as this uh, way of moving forward in our growth, then I think it just completely flips the paradigm of what marriage is about and what we're looking for when we in those relationships.
That was incredible. So, my last lightning round question is about Gaza. And it's not about the specifics of the politics, it's about the impact it's having on Muslims and Muslim communities and people around the world generally. And it's not just the awareness of what's happening, which itself is painful enough. I grew up reading about and watching clips from Bosnia, from Chechnya, from Kashmir. Certainly, there's a lot of violence in the United States that we are exposed to. It's the nature of the exposure I'm speaking to and what impacts it may be having on us and our kids that we see. I mean, sometimes I open my Instagram feeds, and frankly, I see things that I don't want to, I don't know how to see or unsee. And the cumulative impact of that on a daily basis, I don't know what it's doing to us, but we become directly exposed to conflicts in ways that perhaps people never were before unless they were physically present. And
Right.
I'm just wondering what you would counsel us to keep in mind in this moment.
Yeah. No, it's a huge issue, and it's an effect of globalization. Globalization has so many impacts of like we're meant as human beings, or we originally operated in more localized manner, so that you were concerned with what was in your local area, and there was a relative ability to have the capacity to manage what is in within your locus of control, right? And there's a certain human element that when we spend so much time focusing on things that are out of our locus of control, we feel out of control. And we can spiral to the point where we're out here and we're not rooted in what can I do to help? And so all these people are seeing on their feed all of this trauma and tragedy, and they're just like beside themselves with like, how could this be happening? And I'm seeing this. And what it does is there's this equal level of like pressure to you have to be dealing with this daily, and if you don't, then you're callous and you're not you're not humane. But what you find with people that don't have a way of holding all that capacity, channeling it, they're not gonna be effective in trying to help the problem anyway, because they're spiraling out of control because they're spending all their time focused on what they don't have control over. And so as human beings, the place where we're most in our power and therefore the most able to influence change in the world is when we focus on what is within our locus of control. And so that means, yes, you need to know what's going on in the world, but to a certain degree, you have to limit it so that you can then do what you need to do to be in your power so that you can then put that energy into helping people or helping the problem. And there's an endless permutation of ways to help these things that it doesn't have to look one way. It doesn't have to be the only way that you can help is if you post about it every single day. That may actually be worse for some people. They may need to find a way to focus on what is going to make them feel grounded so they can put that energy into something that's actually going to make an impact and actually help. And so we've got to see this much more dynamically and recognize that it's not natural for us to see everything that's going on in the world because it's not within our localized locus of control. And so we've got to limit that just like we limit our intake of digital devices. It's the information. And then with that, we've got to make sure that we're taking care of our own heart and our own, people have this notion that like, well, it's a privilege to take care of myself when other people are suffering. So therefore I'm going to neglect any self-care because it's only worthwhile if it's for the collective. And that's just it's coming from the right place, but it's not aligned with the reality of human capacity and psychology. Like you've got to put your own mask on before you can put on somebody else's mask.
No, I appreciate that. And one final thing I'll say before I hand it over to Joey is I hope that in that spirit, one of the things that's been a very powerful reminder for me in this conversation is the underlying commonness of our human natures. And while we should speak out against injustice, we should also, I think, always be alive to. And it's something I'm just speaking to Muslim communities as well. And I try to remember for myself that just as we consume images of people who've been hurt and traumatized in conflicts based on perhaps what we pay attention to, others may consume similar images and context from the conflicts that they are immersed in or connected to. And so oftentimes I think we lose that because we live within our feed. And that doesn't take away from the larger, I think, social and systemic issues and real facts on the ground, but should also keep us mindful of, and I think to remember the compassion that is part of our nature and that other people are struggling with or might not know what to do with. So thank you so much for participating in Lightning Round. I apologize. That was a lot. Joey, I'm kicking it back to you.
That was the slowest, heaviest lightning round I've ever heard. So,
it's a new form of lightning.
It's a new form of lightning. Yeah, but I think just to kind of piggyback on Haroon a little bit there, I wanted to ask one more question for our audience as they're coming away from this conversation. What's one thing that they can do to turn back to remember their true nature? And I know, like, we have Christians, we have Muslims, we have people of, I mean, all kind of varieties. So I don't think people are going to pick up prayer beads or recite the 99 names of God, right? But is there one thing that everybody could do to turn back and remember who they are?
Absolutely. Great question. And my answer to this is a saying that I have that I always say is, we find our nature in nature. And so it doesn't matter what religion or walk of life you are. We all need to spend time connected to nature. Like there's a fundamental, practical reality in that no matter how much we're trying to grapple with big theological questions or mental health issues or anxiety and depression, when we spend time in nature reflecting on the state of the natural world, which is always in a state of order and balance, even when there's, turmoil, that has an impact on our being. It can actually come into us through osmosis by literally being around nature. We can come into alignment and come into our truth without having to do all this work where we're trying to analyze and uncover and figure out and fix. And it's like some of it, a lot of it just kind of takes care of itself when we live in accord with these natural rhythms.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to. For the next episode, we'll be speaking with John Faraday, director of Cincinnati's Mercantile Library, about why he chose to stay in Cincinnati, the library's history and mission, and how it fosters civic dialogue and cultural life. He also shares personal stories about his faith journey and surviving a pancreas transplant, emphasizing gratitude, empathy, and striving to live a present life in honor of his donor.